For more than 300 years, people have stood on Salisbury Plain and asked the same question: who built this circle of stones? And why did they choose this exact spot, on this exact patch of English chalk, to raise blocks of rock that some of them dragged for well over 100 miles? Historians gave us an answer that felt safe and tidy. Farmers and tribal communities, driven by faith, built a temple over many generations. It is a nice story. It is also, according to a new passive analysis run through GROK AI earlier this year, probably only the surface of something much stranger. When researchers finally fed centuries of surveys, laser scans, soil reports, astronomical tables, and buried archive data into a single AI system and asked it to simply look for patterns no human had connected before, the picture that came back was not a gentle correction. It was a quiet, unsettling reordering of almost everything we thought we understood about this place. Before we go further, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because what you are about to hear is going to change the way you look at every old stone circle on Earth. Let's start with the obvious. Stonehenge sits about 90 miles west of London, alone in an open field, and from a distance it looks almost small, almost quaint. It is only once you are standing beneath the outer ring that the scale hits you. The largest sarsen stones tower over 20 feet high and weigh as much as 25 tons each, hauled from the Marlborough Downs roughly 20 miles away. Inside that outer ring stand the smaller bluestones, each still weighing up to 4 tons, and long believed to have traveled from the Preseli Hills in Wales, a distance of around 140 miles. Newer geological sampling has even raised the possibility that some of these stones may trace back further still, deep into southern Scotland. Construction stretched across roughly 1,000 years, beginning near 3000 BCE with a simple ditch and bank, then pits, then finally the raising of the great stones themselves. All of this happened without metal tools, without the wheel as we know it in transport, without any of the machinery a modern engineer would consider a bare minimum for moving stone at this scale. That contradiction, staggering effort against primitive technology, is exactly the kind of anomaly a pattern recognition system is built to chew on. So that is what the researchers did. They stopped treating Stonehenge as a single monument and started treating it as a dataset. GROK AI was not asked to invent anything new. It was not fed speculation, and it was not told what conclusion to reach. It was simply given the raw material: decades of ordnance survey maps, LiDAR elevation models, ground-penetrating radar sweeps, and archaeological field notes going back to the Victorian era, and asked to search for correlations that had never been placed side by side before. That is a very different task from writing a theory. It is closer to asking a machine to notice what 1,000 separate human researchers, each working in their own narrow slice of the problem, never had the chance to see all at once. And within the first few passes, something in the numbers refused to behave the way a random or purely ceremonial layout should behave. The first thread worth pulling is the ring of pits just inside the earthwork boundary, known to archaeologists as the Aubrey Holes, named after the 17th century antiquarian who first recorded them. There are 56 of these pits. Some once held cremated human remains. Some appear to have always been empty. For a long time, the working assumption was that any unevenness in their spacing was simply the result of Neolithic builders, working without precise measuring tools, human error baked into stone. When GROK was given the millimeter-level survey data of these pits and asked to model the spacing as a sequence rather than a static ring, the output was not noise. It was rhythm, plotted in order. The distances between the pits traced something close to a repeating wave, rising and falling in a pattern that echoes the mathematical shape of the moon's 18.6-year nodal cycle, the long, slow swing in which the moon's rising and setting points drift between their most northern and most southern extremes before returning. That is not a spacing you get from careless digging. That is a spacing you get from someone tracking a celestial cycle across decades and then translating that observation into physical distance. Here is where the number 56 stops looking arbitrary. Multiply 18.6 by 3, and you land at 55.8, a hair's breadth from 56. It is not a flawless match, but in a field where exact ratios rarely survive 5,000 years of weather and reconstruction, it is close enough to raise real questions. If this reading holds, The Aubrey holes were never just graves or empty ceremonial pits. They may have functioned as a slow, physical counter, a ring you could walk and read like a calendar built for tracking not a single year, but a multi-decade lunar rhythm. That means the people who dug these 56 holes were not simply glancing at the night sky. They were recording it, night after night, season after season, for long enough to notice a cycle that takes almost 2 decades to complete. And then they were encoding that knowledge into the ground with enough precision that it still shows up in the data 5,000 years later. Builders who could do that were not just laborers moving rock. They were long-term observers, patient record keepers, and something closer to engineers of memory. The second thread is stranger, and it has to do with sound. The great sarsen stones were not simply stacked. They were shaped, dressed, and fitted with horizontal lintels on top, forming a closed circular ring rather than a loose scatter of pillars. For years this was read purely as architectural ambition, but when the complete layout, stones, lintels, spacing, and all, was modeled acoustically, a very different function emerged. According to the AI-supported modeling, a fully intact Stonehenge would have behaved something like a resonant chamber. Sound entering that enclosed ring would not simply echo and fade the way it does in an open field. It would reflect, layer, and concentrate at specific points inside the circle, producing what acousticians call standing waves, areas where sound energy builds rather than dissipates. Some of the modeled frequencies fall into the infrasound range, somewhere around 95 to 120 Hz, low enough that human ears barely register it as sound at all. What people do register, according to research into low-frequency exposure, is a physical sensation, a pressure in the chest, a shift in heart rate, in some documented cases, a subtle but real change in emotional state. If that modeling is accurate even in part, then Stonehenge was never designed purely to be looked at. It may have been built to be felt, a structure engineered so that simply standing inside it altered something in the body before a single ritual word was spoken. That idea becomes considerably harder to dismiss once you look at what has actually been found on the ground. Cremated human remains have turned up across the site, including within several of the Aubrey holes themselves. Officially, this places Stonehenge squarely in the category of a funerary and ceremonial landscape, a fair and well-supported reading. But when the locations of those remains were cross-referenced against the acoustic modeling, a pattern surfaced that nobody had gone looking for. Several of the points where the modeled sound energy is strongest sit close to where human remains were recovered. That correlation is not proof of intention, and no serious researcher is claiming it is. But it opens an uncomfortable possibility. What if Stonehenge functioned less like a static memorial and more like what you might call an experience chamber, a space where chanting, drumming, or simply the resonance of the stones themselves was used to shift the mental and physical state of the people standing inside it during moments of loss, ritual, or transition? Not a quiet place to remember the dead, but an active structure built to make grief, or reverence, or whatever emotion the moment demanded, physically undeniable. This is also where the choice of the bluestones stops looking like a matter of convenience. If the builders only needed rock, there was plenty of usable stone far closer to Salisbury Plain than the Preseli Hills of Wales. Hauling 4-ton blocks across 140 miles of ancient terrain, with no wheeled transport worth the name, is not a decision anyone makes lightly. So why go to that extreme? One clue lies in the stones themselves. Several bluestone outcrops in the Preseli region are known to ring like a bell when struck, producing a clear, sustained tone rather than a dull thud. Once you connect that property to the acoustic modeling of the finished monument, a new explanation emerges. The bluestones may not have been chosen for their size or their color. They may have been chosen for their pitch. Different stones, struck or resonating under sound, would have produced different tones, and arranged correctly inside a structure already shaped to concentrate sound. Those tones could have combined into something closer to a tuned instrument than a pile of rock. It is the same principle a modern concert hall architect uses when deciding what material belongs on which wall, except this version was built with no formal acoustics, no digital modeling, and no written record, just observation, trial, and an extraordinary amount of patience passed down across generations. None of this makes sense, though. If you keep picturing Stonehenge as an isolated structure standing alone in an empty field, it never was. Pull back and look at the wider landscape using LiDAR and geophysical survey data, and Stonehenge stops looking like the main event. It starts looking like the center point of something much larger. Spread across several kilometers around it are earthwork enclosures, burial mounds, long processional avenues, and traces of timber circles that have mostly vanished above ground but remain visible underneath. Individually, each of these features has its own modest archaeological story. Together, mapped and cross-referenced by AI pattern analysis, they begin to form geometry. Certain burial mounds line up into near-perfect triangles, with Stonehenge sitting at a vertex. Certain avenues run in dead straight lines for kilometers, aligned toward specific horizon points rather than wandering the way a casual footpath would. English. Heritage and UNESCO already acknowledge that Stonehenge sits within a much broader prehistoric landscape rather than standing alone, which is precisely why the World Heritage designation covers the surrounding acreage and not just the stone circle itself. What the AI analysis adds is scale. This was not a cluster of unrelated monuments built by different groups over different centuries for different reasons. The alignments are too consistent, too deliberate, for coincidence to carry the whole explanation. And this is where the timeline gets genuinely disorienting. Several of the earthworks and burial mounds in this wider landscape predate the raising of the Great Sarsen stones by centuries. That means the famous stone circle, the part everyone photographs and everyone assumes came first, was not the beginning of the plan. It was closer to the final chapter. The blueprint for this landscape existed before the monument we recognize today was ever built. Whoever laid down that first geometry was not designing for their own lifetime. They were designing for descendants who would not be born for hundreds of years, trusting that the plan would survive long enough to be finished by people they would never meet. That kind of intergenerational commitment raises an obvious and uncomfortable question. How does a society with no writing system, as far as we know, preserve a precise architectural and astronomical plan across 5, 10, maybe 20 generations without the whole thing drifting into guesswork? Oral tradition is one possibility. A dedicated class of ritual specialists trained specifically to memorize and transmit this knowledge is another. Either way, what we are looking at is not casual folklore. It behaves like an inherited technical discipline, something closer to an engineering tradition than a religious custom that simply repeated itself out of habit. And the data suggests that discipline did not hold forever. When the different construction phases were compared for precision, rather than just chronology, a clear decline appears. The earliest layouts, the original placement of the bluestones, and the first Sarsen alignments show remarkably tight tolerances, with an average deviation from ideal alignment measured at around 3.2 centimeters, which is close to the limit of what you would expect from careful hand measurement using ropes and sight lines. Later phases, the rearrangements and additions that came after, show deviations closer to 12.7 centimeters, a fourfold drop in precision. Tool marks on some individual stones tell the same story up close. Different techniques appear layered on the same block, as though later builders were working over earlier work, sometimes leaving sections unfinished, sometimes returning years afterward to attempt a different approach entirely. In most human technical traditions, skill improves with practice. Here the opposite happened. The people building the later phases were not innovating. They were trying to replicate something they had inherited but did not fully understand, working from instructions, memory, or tradition that had already begun to fray at the edges. It reads less like a civilization advancing and more like a civilization slowly losing its grip on a system a previous generation had mastered completely. Which brings us to the ending, because Stonehenge does have one. Around 1600 BCE, activity at the site drops off sharply, but the way it was left behind does not look like abandonment in the usual sense. A place simply walked away from and forgotten. Some stones were deliberately lowered rather than left standing or allowed to fall naturally. Certain sections show signs of intentional covering rather than gradual burial through weather and time. It has the feel of a decision rather than a collapse, as if the people responsible for this place understood they could no longer maintain what had been built, but were not willing to let it simply vanish either. They chose to preserve it in the ground rather than let it erode into meaninglessness above it. Put every one of these threads together, and the picture that forms is very different from the one most of us grew up with. Not a simple temple built by devoted farmers over a few patient centuries, but something closer to a layered system, a lunar tracking mechanism disguised as a ring of pits, an acoustic chamber disguised as a circle of standing stones, a network of aligned monuments disguised as scattered burial mounds, and underneath all of it, a body of astronomical and engineering knowledge that was deliberately built to outlast the people who first understood it. The most unsettling part is not any single piece of this. It is the trajectory. A system built with near-perfect precision at the start, slowly degrading across generations as the people maintaining it lost more and more of the original understanding, until finally what was left of that knowledge was folded into the earth rather than allowed to disappear completely.